Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, what we can accomplish nowadays with computers when it comes to 3D modeling and animations and design work is pretty amazing, but it hasn't always been that way. Of course, relatively recently, things were very, very different. Huge drawing offices were full of designers using pens and ink and markers to bring their ideas to life and basically transition them from paper eventually to real steel things, amazing structures like bridges and especially ships. On this channel, we've talked a lot about the way ships are designed. We haven't talked a lot about the actual plans themselves. They come in all different shapes and sizes, and I thought today we could do something kind of fun. I thought we'd look at a set of plans that are some of my absolute favorites. They're absolutely spectacular. Beautiful color illustrations of a very famous ship called the Mauretania. So today, let's wind back the clock to the early 1900s when designers were sitting down with their drawing squares and their pens trying to bring this ship to life in a new segment I like to call Grand Plans. Now, the first set of plans we're going to look at are for the Mauretania. Now, the Mauretania, as I mentioned, is extremely famous. First of all, she was the sister ship, kind of, I'll explain that in a minute, sister ship and running mate to Lusitania, arguably the more famous ship, mainly because of the tragedy. Mauretania was a real thoroughbred greyhound of a thing. It was designed mainly for speed, and that's definitely going to come through as we look at these plans. Now, these plans are held by the Royal Museum in Greenwich, in England, and some friends and I went in and bought a couple of sets of these so we can zoom right in and get some really nice detail. And the first thing you'll notice about these plans is they're in color. So this is a pretty remarkable, huge side profile plan. It's called the rigging plan, and it's essentially completed by the designers to show Cunard Line's executives what Mauretania could look like when she's finished. And what's really cool about this plan is they've marked out a lot of things that other designers typically don't mark out in their plans. So they've got the ship's nameplate colored in, they've used the correct colors for the hull and things like that. So they've actually gone to a lot of effort coloring this plan, but it also serves a purpose, which is to show off what all the rigging does. So let's fly around it and have a look. So here you can see all of the various kinds of rigging and things. Again, so this is essentially a ink and watercolor plan. So they've used a mixture of paints to try and get these colors. You can see already, just having a look at some of the detail here, they've even gone so far as to put at the top of the mast here, just above the American flag, you can see what looks like a little wind vane. And there's actually a lightning rod attached to that, so that the lightning could be directed away from the wireless antenna, which is below the flag, and actually strike that point, which isn't a big deal at all, because the top part of the mast, from probably around about here up where these lights are, is made out of wood, because it's in contact with the wireless antenna, and you don't want metal touching electrical wires like that. That's bad news. What's really funny about this plan, though, is they've even gone to the effort of painting in the sky and the background, which is really nice. So it's showing off all the different kinds of rigging which can be used. So you can see that Mauretania has been equipped with these big cargo derricks, and you can see they've marked in on the plans the blocks, their positions where they could be like kind of posed to pick cargo up and load them inside the ship. I cannot get over how beautiful these plans are, how stunningly well drawn they are, and you have to remember that this was all done by hand, and they're well over 110 years old. Almost 120 years old, and they've held up really, really well. They're beautiful plans. One thing that you get a sense of straight away is actually when we zoom out and get like a full length view of the ship, you really get a sense of how simple it is. It really is just like hull, and then a very, very little bit of the superstructure on top, the white part of the structure there. The superstructure is, of course, sitting on top of the hull. It's essentially full of a lot of the public rooms and things like that. And one of the plans we look at after this is a cross-section where you can look right down the middle of the ship and see all the public rooms, which is very, very cool. One thing that made Mauretania stand out over her sister was the amount of these big, tall cowl vents, is what they're called, and they essentially look like big elephant ears. They're like the classic vent that everyone thinks of when they think of old steamships, and Mauretania had a whole bunch of them. And the reason they're different to those on Lusitania is because Mauretania and Lusitania are actually built to the same basic layout, but by two different shipyards and companies. And it was a bit of a move by Cunard Line to ensure that the two sister ships would be of their optimum quality. And by getting two different yards to build them, you had a little bit of, shall we say, friendly rivalry going on. So they're both going to be going out of their way to try and make the best ship. So Lusitania's vents look completely different to this. They were just like little drum vents that kind of look like bins with lids on them. The designers here, the planners, have made it very helpful for us to see a lot of the details that you might otherwise miss. For example, the amount of deck lights. You can see these little yellow circles along the superstructure here. So these are deck lamps, and they're all electric because Mauretania was powered by electricity. She had some very complicated plant down there to enable her to actually function as a modern ship with a full electrical system. And for a long time, it was really hard to actually get adequate lighting for passengers if they wanted to walk around at nighttime, because the ocean is a very dark place. And if you can't see where you're going, a ship is really not a fun place to be, because you can fall down ladders, or you can trip over, bollards, or you can trip over bits of equipment that are left lying around. So we take it for granted now, but if you ever go on a cruise ship, or you go on the Queen Mary 2, for example, today, you'll see it's just covered in lights outside. Interestingly, though, they did turn these off at a certain point during the night, when they essentially figured that everyone was in bed, usually around 10, 11 p.m. or midnight. The deck lights would be extinguished, but you can actually see how many there are. There's a lot. What else is really cool about these plans here is that we get a sense of the original lifeboat layout for the Mauretania. So she had a set of 4 boats back here towards the stern of the ship, and a big blank space in the middle, and then towards the bow of the ship we had another 4 boats. And this is essentially identical to Titanic's main lifeboat layout. And Titanic gets all the flack for going to sea without enough boats for everyone on board, but of course every other ship essentially did that at the same time. And as we can see from this, Mauretania was one of them. And later on in her career, after the Titanic sank, they filled that nice little blank space there with more lifeboats, for good reason. It's so eye-achingly beautiful. Again, really, really unusual to see plans like this in colour. The artist has used watercolours. It's a really beautiful effect. But then I think they might have used oils on the funnel to get that really bright, deep red for the Cunard funnels. I think Mauretania is one of the most beautiful ships ever built. You really get a sense of the sleekness. You can see that she's a Greyhound designed for speed. One of the things that is quite funny, though, is to contrast how modern Mauretania was, like those electrical systems and things I was telling you about, with just these big bits of equipment just lying around. So this is a water tank that's just sitting behind the 4th funnel. And the Lusitania and the Mauretania were covered in a lot of these pieces of equipment that just litter the top deck. Because in theory, they would be out of sight of passengers, because passengers were not allowed up there. Passengers were allowed here on the boat deck. You couldn't really go up to the top deck because that was not allowed, and there are these ladders here. You can see one here leading down, but that was for crew only. And for good reason. One of those reasons being these things. Thermotanks. Thermotanks, we've talked a little bit about these on the channel before, but they're essentially a early form of air conditioning that could essentially create hot air by heating it with steam in pipes. They probably would have been a little hot to the touch, especially the tank where the steam was kept. So you don't want your passengers up there kind of walking around and touching things. That's bad news. Another really unique design feature of the Lusitania and the Mauretania was the split between this part of the superstructure, which was for first class, and this part of the superstructure, which was for second class. And as if to make the delineation any clearer, there's literally a break between the second class's structural island here at the stern of the ship and the little area forward of that, which is for first class. And there's these little bridges here that just run across the gap, and so passengers or crew more likely could get from one part of the ship to the other. But they would have had gates here to separate first and second class. Very class-based society, of course. An interesting little detail, which I think is really cool, is that the designers have included camber as a detail. So I'll explain myself. You see how the railings look like they kind of flick up at the ends? They don't. They just actually, when they go across the ship's width, they're following the ship's camber. And the camber is essentially the upper decks sag down at either side, and it's essentially to provide runoff for water if it gathers on the deck, but also back then provided some more structural rigidity. It made it a little stronger. And you can see here that very cleverly the designers have got it. If you did look at something from the side like this, if the ship in cross-section was curved like that, it would look like the railings kind of flick up. And you can see it everywhere all over the drawing, and it's really nicely done. You can see it especially here at the docking bridge. This is right at the stern of the ship. And you can see that the sides of the docking bridge look like they're kind of like sagging down towards the ocean. That's a really nice little detail. Very, very impressive work. They've also included a lot of details on the hull, like the plating. You can see the strakes following the lines of the hull. And it's pretty amazing, again, when you think that this was just done by hand, by people in a big office, just working with inks and markers and all kinds of things. What a beautiful plan. How cool. Good job. But now we're going to do something even more fun, because the designers of the Mauretania, well, they didn't just draw the outside of the ship, they also drew the inside. And the inside is where things get even more interesting. This is a sectional elevation. It's longitudinal. Essentially, what they've done is they've taken the Mauretania and cut it in half, right down the middle. And now we can go inside and have a look, like we've got X-ray vision, like we're Superman or something. This is amazing. So again, just to remind you, all done by hand. Immediately obvious is the fact that so much of this ship's internal space is chewed up by machinery. So Mauretania's whole reason for being was speed. She was meant to be the fastest ship at sea. And fair play to them, she was. She was the fastest ship, and she held that record for a very, very long time. But it came at a little expense for the designers, because getting that much horsepower out of steam turbine engines back then required a monumental amount of coal. Mauretania would be burning hundreds of tons of stuff every day. And so you had to have the boilers, you had to have the steam turbines. Let's follow the steam on its journey and see just how much space of the Mauretania is taken up by the engines. So here we've got the forward boiler rooms. Now you can see what's really cool is they've included the big main steam lines that run all the way down. Essentially, the boilers, as they're boiling that water off into steam, the water is being taken by these main lines aft towards the engines. Another interesting thing are the fan rooms here. These big Scirocco fans. They're a centrifugal fan, and they essentially draw air from the upper decks, and that's what those big vents are for. So if you actually look a little further up, you'll see there are some big stokehold vents right here. And so what they're doing is they're providing a channel for fresh air to be drawn in, and the fan all the way down at the bottom of the ship is drawing that air in and then depositing it into the boiler room, into the boilers to create a more efficient burn, and also provide some fresh air, because it's pretty nightmarish down there. The temperatures down in the boiler rooms back then used to run as hot as, you know, your 40s and 50s degrees Celsius, which is like 120 plus Fahrenheit. So kind of scary. To also help with keeping things cooler, you can see that there's essentially just a big vacant void right down the middle here. And that was trunking that essentially held the uptakes. So you can see the uptakes and the lower funnel, which is this big kind of like tree trunk looking thing with the branches, or really like the roots at the bottom. The uptakes are taking the hot gases and the fumes from the furnaces in the boilers up to the funnel so they can be blown away behind the ship. But there's also just blank space around the uptakes. And the reason being is that at the top of those blank spaces were openings, gratings, and very simply, hot air rises. So the idea would be, hopefully, as you're bringing fresh air in with those fans in the fan rooms, it's displacing hot air, which itself is just floating up and out of the ship. I don't know that it was that successful as a system, because it was still pretty nightmarish in the boiler rooms of ships like this. But a little later in her career, Mauretania was converted to oil burning, so it meant that all of that coal and all that dust, it was done away with, and life was a lot better for the few stokers and firemen who stayed behind working on the ship. So steam is being created, and it is being fed into the main steam lines. If we follow it back, you can see that unlike Titanic and Olympic, every funnel, all 4 funnels, are connected directly to a set of boilers. So we get to this point in the ship. We're now at the 4th funnel. And this is where things very interestingly start to happen. So the main steam lines feed directly into the ship's turbines. Now, Mauretania had 4 propellers. Each one had its own dedicated turbine for running ahead. So the steam turbines are essentially, we've talked again a lot about turbines on this channel, but imagine a big rotor drum with hundreds of little fan blades sticking out of it inside of a casing. And if you blast that steam that's super hot, it's under a lot of pressure through that casing, it's going to turn the rotor with the blades attached to it. Now that's obviously attached directly to the ship's shaft and then the propellers at the very end. But they can only run in one direction. So the blade angles on the rotors back then couldn't be changed. So there had to be a separate set of turbines for running the ship backwards. The astern turbines, which are obviously a lot smaller and not as powerful, but essentially meant that Mauretania could run forwards at immense speed and then backwards at slower speed, but at least she could still run backwards. So you can just make out the outline of some of the turbines down here, but taking up even more space are the condensers. Right here. The condenser does the job of essentially turning the steam back into water and sending it back through the system. The condenser is very important because they're handling a huge amount of steam and water and keeping the system going in this sort of closed loop. And then again, we talked about how hot air rises out of the ship. You can see that Mauretania had a pretty extensive kind of like shaft leading out of the engine room here with a skylight at the top, essentially again providing natural light down into the bottom of the engine room, and then hot air would float out and hopefully provide a little bit of relief for the poor engineering crew. Unlike the older style of engine, triple expansion steam engine, the turbines are extremely loud and they kind of make this shrieking, grinding noise, which is horrifying to listen to. So I certainly do not envy the men who are working in the bottom of the ship. This plan gives us a really good picture of how the passenger accommodations and the public rooms and things here. So we can see here the second class main stairwell right here, because this is the big second class tower of the ship that I was telling you about. They had to work everything around the engines. So the passengers, even though they're paying for this ship and they're essentially the main reason for being, they're kind of like playing second fiddle to these enormous pieces of machinery. Because again, now that we've come to the end of our steam journey, if we zoom right out, you can see just how much of the ship is taken up by the engines. The other thing that designers had to deal with back then were the uptakes themselves, because they go right through the middle of the ship. And you would probably want to have these beautiful, long, flowing public rooms, and it was a huge pain, because all the way through, you had the funnels evenly spaced apart, and the uptakes were running right through the middle of your nice, fancy lounge. And so for a long time, designers just basically had to squeeze lounges and things in between the funnel uptakes. So you can see here, for example, between funnels 3 and 4, we've got the main first-class dining saloon down here in the bottom of the ship, where you've got this big, beautiful dome that's inset over this 2-story tall dining saloon, which is very, very cool. And then above it, one of the first-class lounges, I think, which is, again, fed with natural light from a dome above it, and just nestled in between the funnels, because the uptakes were at either end. Until designers figured out with later ships like the Vaterland in 1914 that you could actually have the funnel uptakes of the ship running out from the boilers to the sides of the ship and then meeting at the top, kind of like a cathedral. It created this huge empty space in the middle. and then you could have those long interrupted rooms. But back then, they really weren't doing it. So designers kind of had to, work around the constraints, and it was a never-ending battle for designers to make ships feel comfortable and like a hotel, but then also have to deal with the fact that you've got 15,000 tons of steam machinery all over the place. Not that much, but you know what I mean. If we go back to the stern of the ship for a minute, you can see the shaft as it's leaving the turbine here. The propeller shaft runs all the way through and out. You can see how quite long it is. And again, very difficult to ensure that these things didn't break as the ship was bending and flexing. And essentially, the shaft was made up of multiple individual components of, steel, basically steel cylinder. And they were joined together in such a way that they could actually bend and flex with the ship as they went. They just had to be reinforced with brackets as they went all the way through and out of the ship. And when we get to the stern of the ship here, you can see just how much of it is actually being used for tanks. So we've got the after peak tank here. And this is a really big tank. It's about 2 stories tall. And again, it's just an empty space that's full of water. And it does 2 things. So first of all, it means you can take on ballast and essentially adjust if your ship is loaded, for example, with too much coal towards the stern of the ship, and it's therefore sitting lower in the water at the stern. You could let some water out of this. There'd be a couple of 100 tons of water in there. Let it out with valves, and the stern would become more buoyant, and it would lift. And of course, at the other end of the ship, we have a nice corresponding forward peak tank right here. This one's bigger. So that's 202 tons of probably seawater that would be held at the peak tank at the bow here. And that way you can adjust what is called the trim of your ship, which is if it's sitting too far forward, you let water out of the fore peak tank, or you just put more water in the aft tank. We'll come back to the bow in a minute. One of the other things that's really interesting about the stern here is the fact that Mauretania had a little nasty secret. And even though, yes, she was a passenger ship first and foremost, she was also secretly designed to go to war, because British imperialism in the early 1900s was incorrigible. And there's a couple of dead giveaways that show that Mauretania had a secret ulterior motive behind her design. And one of those was actually the placement of her emergency steering wheel, or helm. So we can actually see, of course, the ship would have the main steering wheel all the way forward at the bridge. Now, this was connected to the after steering engines, which were down here. The steering gear is right above the ship's rudder. So here's the rudder. That's how the ship's steering its way through the water. The steering gear here is essentially a big steam engine that is geared directly to the rudder, and it's basically reacting to inputs from a system, a hydraulic system, actuated all the way forward here in the bridge, in the wheelhouse, by a thing called the telemotor. So here's the wheelhouse, and you can see it's enclosed, it's protected, so that that wheel, the main helm, is not going to be broken or damaged by big waves. And the telemotor that the wheel is sitting on essentially translates the inputs of the helmsman steering the wheel into hydraulic lines that can then mechanically feed back all the way back here, 600 or 700 feet away, at the stern of the ship, directly into the steering gear, which turns the steam engine, which turns the ship's rudder. Now, there's an obvious problem with this, which is if there's something wrong with your hydraulics, or there's a break in the line, or the telemotor's not working, how do you steer the ship? Well, fortunately, there was also made allowance for an emergency steering room right here. And this was actually inside the docking bridge. So just below the top of the docking bridge, inside this little compartment, there was an emergency steering room. And essentially the way this worked is this was also keyed directly into the steering engines. How far below is that? Like 4 or 5 stories below, right here. And basically, if there was a problem, the crew, the captain and the senior officers could stay at the bridge and send... with a telegraph, a steering telegraph, they could send orders directly back to the emergency steering position here. So the guys in here wouldn't even really necessarily need to see where they were going, because they're just responding to orders from the bridge further up. But The Mauretania also had a secret third steering position. And this is the real dead giveaway that she was a warship. Secretly a warship. Because here is the auxiliary steering gear room. And this is obviously a backup in case the main steering gear goes, but it was possible to steer the ship from down here as well. Now, why would you need a third steering position all the way down here? Well, it's below the waterline. You can see that the waterline is here, and the emergency and auxiliary steering machine rooms are down here. And that was basically to protect them from gunfire. It was presumed that Mauretania could be converted into a cruiser, and she could hunt down a German shipping and engage them with guns. In practice, it turned out not to work so well, and so Mauretania was converted into a troop ship and a hospital ship. But by putting things like your emergency steering room down here below the waterline, it meant that you would hopefully be protected from large or, ship caliber gun hits. In practice, again, it doesn't work because a shell falling short of its target isn't necessarily badly slowed by the water. It actually just activates the fuse earlier, meaning that it could blow a hole in the side of the ship before it reaches it. So for a smaller caliber gun, like a 4 or 5 inch gun, maybe it would protect the Mauretania. But anything bigger than that is cutting straight through it. Like, Mauretania is not designed with armor. If a battleship or something, if a heavy cruiser with, 8-inch guns engaged the Mauretania, she'd be cut apart like Swiss cheese. And it did happen to other ships early in the war. But the designers back then, I think, were a little bit optimistic with what they thought these ships could do during wartime. Another example of Mauretania's modernity is quite cool. You can see here there is actually an electric lift. So Mauretania was fitted with lifts both for passengers and cargo. So this one's got a Bostwick gate, you can see here, and it could essentially run all the way down here into the baggage room. This is baggage, so this is storage specifically for passenger bags. And the reason ships had dedicated baggage rooms is because Mauretania is getting you to New York from Liverpool, for example, right? So you have, say you're going away for 6 months. You've got a week-long voyage on the Mauretania that you have to pack for and get dressed every night and wear your clothes, of course. And then when you get to New York, you have all the things that you want to take with you to live in your house. Now, the things you want to take with you to live in your house, you don't need on the Mauretania. So what passengers did back then was they would have 1 or 2 bags, or if you were some of the first-class passengers, you might have 10 trunks, for example, of clothes that you wanted to wear on board the ship. But then you might have as many bags that you didn't want to have with you in your stateroom. And so on boarding day, you would put stickers on the things you wanted that literally said, wanted. And those would be taken by stewards to your cabin. If you had bags you didn't need, you would put a sticker on that said, not wanted. And they would end up down here, in the baggage room. And then you could claim them at the end of your voyage. A very clever little system. Going back to the plans for a minute here again, it's just like how beautiful the detail is. You can zoom right in and really get a sense of the craftsmanship that went into the drawings alone. The drawings are just as impressive as the finished ships. It's absolutely superb. Look at the paneling they've drawn in here. Gorgeous. So yeah, these are all second-class spaces, and if we go a little further forward, you'll see this is where first class begins. So you can see there was this little palm court cafe at the stern of the ship that was pretty popular. It was a very open and airy space. You can see it had some nice trees and things in it. I don't know that it was as popular as much as the Cunard line wanted, but other similar spaces and other ships did really well. This was half open to the elements at one end, which maybe harmed its popularity a little bit because it's cold and kind of miserable on the North Atlantic a lot of the time. Interestingly though, the person doing this plan, or the team doing this plan, just didn't bother showing the cabins for first class. So here you can see it just says first class accommodation, and they haven't actually drawn the cabins in. I get the feeling maybe they ran out of time and couldn't really be bothered. But this doesn't look like the plan from somebody who can't really be bothered, you know what I mean? This is also eye-achingly beautiful. It's so cool. What a beautiful ship. This is another one of those lifts I was telling you about. You can actually just see here the machinery room. for the lift. You can see these wheels at the top here. I think this is the lift machinery housing here. And then here is the counterweight, potentially. And then here is the lift cab. And so you can actually just see the line runs all the way up here, through these rollers, down here. And it looks like if that is the counterweight, which I think it is, it's very cleverly concealed within the funnel casing, which is quite cool. You can see there's a lift cab down here as well. It was, again, like the scourge of passengers back then to have to climb all these sets of stairs, because for the longest time, ships had been big, you know, but not stories tall. You might have to climb maybe 3 flights of stairs to get from your cabin to dinner or vice versa. But at this point, you know, this ship is very tall, and people in their finery didn't really like, back then, walking up 9 flights, as we don't now. And so the idea of having electric lifts on ships back then, we take it for granted because we're used to it now. But that was like revolutionary back then. So cool. This is so early. I mean, Mauretania was actually planned and designed years before she was finished. So she was introduced around 1907, 1908. They'd been planning her since, you know, the earlier 1900s, you know, 1904. So it's pretty impressive technology when you think this is such a long time ago now. And it's just amazing to think it was all done by hand. Love it. Just moving forward here, we see more of the boiler rooms and things. So this is all first class accommodations and things. First class ends around about where the bridge is. So here's the bridge and the officers' quarters. We can see there's a compass binnacle up here above the bridge that could be used for ascertaining the ship's position and direction. But here is where we start to see the third class accommodations. So traditionally, third class were housed, you know, towards the stern of the ships or towards the bow, where things are a little less comfortable because you're at either extreme end of the ship. All the way up here, there's a lot of loud machinery. The ship would be pitching. It's less likely to bother you if it's in the middle of the ship. At the ends, you're going to have a bit of a rough ride. But that's what a third class ticket bought you, I guess. So you can see, for example, here we have, it looks like the third class saloon or maybe general room, accessible by stairs. But Mauretania's third class was quite nicely decorated. Mauretania and Lusitania had fairly nice third class spaces. A lot of them were panelled in timber, which again is quite unusual for ships at that time, when steerage was basically just thrown into bare steel painted rooms for 6 or 7 days at a time and then deposited at Ellis Island. You can see here another really interesting part of the ship's design, which is just how much of the forward end of the ship is now dedicated to cargo storage. So you can see there's insulated cargo rooms here, insulated tween decks here. You can see there's actually, the designers have marked out quite heavy insulation, probably cork, I would imagine, for, you know, cold storage for foodstuffs and things like that, actually for the voyage. But then the cargo holds themselves, you can see they're covered in these wooden beams, which essentially protect both the exterior of the ship from bulky items if they broke loose, also protected things on the interior of the ship from smashing up against the ship's steel hull, but then also temperature protected things a little bit, because bare steel in the North Atlantic in winter is very cold. You know, the North Atlantic is, in some cases, like just above or at freezing, basically. So things can get very cold down there, and by simply having a timber, be it pine or whatever, just along the sides there, it can add a little bit of insulation so that anything touching it is not going to be possibly damaged by the cold, or you know, the space itself will be maybe a couple of degrees warmer at the very least. This is really cool. You get a sense of how far down into the ship the mast has to go so that it's supported and won't just break off. So you can see here that it goes 2 full decks below. And here almost looks like it goes into someone's room. It would have been really funny if you paid for your fare, even in third class, and you walk in and there's just a giant pole in the middle. So you have to go around it to see your family. Hi, it's me, editing this video sometime later. And it turns out it did go straight through the middle of the cabin. Although it was a crew cabin, so I guess they don't matter as much, do they, 1910's Cunard line? And then, of course, towards the bow section, we get just a lot of machinery. So this is where you had the docking and mooring equipment, the big anchor windlasses and things like that were required to either drop anchor and hold the ship in place if she was visiting. I think they visited Fishguard, for example. She would regularly visit Fishguard and sort of anchor off there. But then going into, say, Liverpool or New York, you would need to rely on these big things, capstans, for example, to wind in your lines and warp your ship into position against the dock. And so they had big steam engines actually down here. You can actually see one right here. This is a steam engine in profile, and they turned with gears the capstans and sort of made them revolve so that you could wrap a line around it and then let it go, and it would wind the line in. And it was all kept in here. And it was all very loud. And again, that's why this is where you've got your crew. Here's the crew lavatory. These are the crew's toilets. Here's steward's accommodations. Oh, how unfortunate. You're right next to the anchor. You're right next to the capstans. You're right next to the big cargo hatches where they'd be lowering tons of cargo in on sailing day. Even now, actually, they will put entertainers on cruise ships. The accommodation is towards the bow of the ship. And it's not really a problem on, say, like the Queen Mary 2, for example, where you're still going from Southampton to New York. It's 6 days at sea. It's not a big problem. But if you're anchoring in a small harbour and they get in about 5 in the morning, this happened to my friends on board Queen Mary 2 when she was visiting Australia. We anchored off Kangaroo Island, and at 5 o'clock in the morning, they let go of the anchor, and my friends were asleep, and directly above their heads, they heard clunk, 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 clunk. And I think it woke them up. So yeah, just a really beautiful plan. Gee, I wish I could draw like this. By hand, remarkable. So that's Mauretania in profile. Really very cool. There's also a whole set of deck plans, but I just realized I've been recording this video for over half an hour, and we've run out of time. It really is a remarkable testament to the spirit of human engineering, an achievement that people could sit down on just a huge piece of paper, like 5-6 feet long, and with markers and ink, do this and bring this ship to life like this, and then actually build it out of steel and timber. It's just remarkable. So cool. AutoCAD and things like that are amazing, but there's something so beautiful about sitting down with your ruler and your pens and your watercolors and just drawing it yourself. So cool. Whoever the illustrators were, they are to be commended because it is a masterpiece. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. And today I thought we'd do something a little bit different and, dare I say, fun. A couple of weeks ago, we made a video about the breakup of the Titanic, and the Titanic Honor and Glory guys were good enough to let me use their brilliant plans of the ship to demonstrate what was going on inside. And while I was looking around the plans, I was fascinated at all the incredible details that they've included. So I thought today we'd talk about the plans in a little bit more detail and have a bit of a look through them. Plans of Titanic are kind of few and far between. It turns out that because Titanic was extremely similar to her sister ship Olympic, there are a lot of plans of Olympic out there in some really nice degree of detail, but unfortunately a lot of plans of Titanic have since been lost. For builders, it was good to keep plans around while your ship was in service, because they needed to know how to fix the ship if she ran into any trouble. Even in cases of emergency, they came in handy. So holding onto the plans wasn't uncommon for a ship with a long career. If a ship sank, the builders typically didn't hold on to plans that long. They weren't really sentimental about it. So often they were just thrown out or destroyed. We don't know for certain what happened to the majority of Titanic's plans, but during the Belfast Blitz in the Second World War, the German Air Force really knocked the hell out of Belfast, and Harland and Wolff bore the brunt of that assault because they were the main industrial part of that city, and a lot of their plans were lost. Their archives, a lot of it was burned, and it's possible that a lot of Titanic's plans were lost then. So recreating the Titanic in plan form is no easy task, which is very impressive when you consider that the Titanic Honor and Glory team, especially Matthew de Winkleer, have worked extremely hard to create this stunning set of plans that I see before me. Now, these plans are available on the Titanic Honor and Glory website, and I'll include a link in the description below. But I thought what we could do is just have a little look around and look at some of the interesting things that kind of stand out. Cool, so we'll start off on the boat deck, which is the uppermost exposed deck of the ship, around about here. The bridge is surprising to some people because there isn't one open space. There's actually a couple of unique little things going on here. Most importantly of all is the fact that the ship's main steering wheel, the helm, is enclosed in a wheelhouse. And this was to protect the ship's main wheel from any damage. Ships the size of Titanic could still cop a big wave over the nose. And in fact, Lusitania in 1910 took a rogue wave that was about 70 feet tall right over her nose, and it bashed her bridge in, and it was forever changed. It sent it back, smashed all the windows, almost washed the crew who were in the bridge at the time out. Pretty dramatic stuff. So you want to protect that wheel. Titanic did have a emergency backup steering position at the back of the ship, towards the stern on the docking bridge, but you want to have your main wheel protected. So it was in this little space, and interestingly, at nighttime, the ship would be sailing along and the helmsman who'd be standing at this little platform here where the main wheel is would have that room enclosed and all the windows shut. They had little wooden shutters and all those shutters would be down. The reason the windows in the wheelhouse had shutters was because at nighttime the bridge had to be in total blackness so that the officers and crew would be able to see in the dark and preserve their night vision ahead. But the wheelhouse needed light so that the helmsman could get a better idea of what he was doing. So the wheelhouse would have the lights on, he could see what he was doing, and then the light wouldn't be escaping out into the main bridge. The navigating bridge itself sits forward of this, and it's an interesting space because it's got a bunch of different telegraphs. So at either side outboard of the navigating bridge, you've got the engine room telegraph, so the port and starboard engines. So this is what you would do to command each engine independently. And actually you could order one engine to go full ahead, the other engine to go astern, and that would actually turn the ship without the rudder's use. One of the interesting telegraphs is the docking telegraph. So this could be used to signal the men who are way back at the stern of the ship how to actually maneuver the ship around when it was in port. If they wanted to cast off the lines, if they wanted to reattach them, if they wanted to slacken the lines, let the ship out a little bit, tighten the lines up if it was drifting too far, they'd be able to telegraph it all the way back, because on the docking bridge at the very stern of the ship, which is that platform right on the back of Titanic, there was a corresponding telegraph. It would send the order through, and then the officer who was in charge at that point would be able to tell the crew at the stern, 800 feet away, what to do. A lot of ships at the time had a docking telegraph at the bow of the ship as well, because in Titanic's case, that was like 200 feet, maybe 150, 200 feet in front of them. So you're not going to be shouting it out with a loudspeaker. There'd be a telegraph there, but Titanic didn't have one. Instead, Titanic had portable deck telephones that could be installed at the very front of the ship so that the officer who was in charge of letting go the lines there would be able to sit with his handpiece to his ear and listen out for any orders and then communicate that they'd been received and all was well. And then that telephone, which stood on a brass pedestal, could be unplugged. There was literally a socket. It could be unplugged, shipped, and then Titanic could go off. I forget exactly where I read it, but it was somebody's memoirs. I think it might have been James Bissett, the Cunard Commodore, who said that the connection on those old telephones was really bad, and you had to almost speak another language in order to actually understand what anybody was saying. There's a lot of detail in the bridge, but we have to move on. Now, another one of those really interesting spaces that you don't really hear a lot about is right here, the elevator gear room. This contained 3 very powerful and extremely impressive electric winches and motors, essentially, that were designed to lift Titanic's elevators up and down. An elevator operating in a shaft like that can create a vacuum, kind of like a plunger, moving up and down. So Titanic needed a special kind of vent in this room to allow air to enter and exit the elevator shaft as that elevator was going up and down. You can see it in a photograph that I'll put up now. Special kind of little mushroom-headed vent, kind of cool. One thing I really like about these plans is, for the first time that I know of, you get a very clear layout of all of the different gym machinery. A lot of this stuff was pretty bizarre. From left to right, I guess, we've got 2 riding machines, otherwise known as the electric camel. This was to simulate riding a horse or a camel. There was a pulley weight machine. Look, that's really similar to what you would expect to find in a gym today, which is quite impressive. There were cycles, so you could actually race the person next to you. There was a little needle that would go around, and you could actually figure out who was doing the faster lap. There's a massage table. All of that seems pretty fine. But on the other side, things get a little bit unusual, because here we have a weighing chair. And although that doesn't sound particularly weird, at the time it was extremely common before exercise to weigh yourself, and then to weigh yourself after exercise. It was thought that you could see some immediate kind of weight loss or results. To the left of that, there's a vibration machine, a trunk rotating machine, and a back rubbing machine. So essentially, you would just sit there and the machine would just kind of move you around a bit and rub you and do all that. And this is very reminiscent of those really bad infomercials that you see at about 2 a.m. where the machine does all the work for you, and by moving you around, you lose weight. We know it's not true. And it's just really interesting that this is kind of like the dawn of this age of them trying to figure out fitness and personal health and well-being. And yeah, they were kind of experimenting with some stuff. It's really cool to actually see what all of these things actually were. This is really cool here. This is back below number 3 funnel, because these are some pretty overlooked spaces as well. You've got the big tank room, which sat over the engine room's casing. That was the big skylight that let all the light and air down into the engine room. But then on the starboard side, there's actually an engineer's smoking room. So the engineers were held in extremely high regard on board ships like this. You got to remember, this is really early on, relatively speaking, in the steamship era. And before then, for hundreds of years, sailors had to know how to haul lines, set sail, trim sail. It was a really organic kind of melding of machine and nature. But then all of a sudden, these smoke-spewing monstrosities like the Titanic appeared. And so suddenly, sailors needed to know things like electronics and machinery and engineering. And so the engineer was like this new age of sailor. By 1912 and Titanic's day, they were very well established. But it's interesting here that the engineers were given their own little promenade. This whole area here was dedicated to engineers so they could stretch their legs. And they got a little smoking room here, which was quite cool. They actually had access with ladders all the way down into the belly of the Titanic through the engine room casing. There was actually just a series of ladders, so they could very easily walk out here, go into the tank room, and then walk through this doorway here down into the bottom of the ship. Speaking of Titanic's officers and ships getting hit with giant waves, just behind the number 1 funnel, there's a really interesting locker here. It says oilskins, and these were the really heavy-duty, thick coats that officers and ship's crew would wear in wet weather. They were oiled, and essentially they were really heavy wet weather gear. And if you had your oilskins on, you're going to be in for a very interesting time. I don't know that they were used very much, and certainly on Titanic, they weren't used at all. Down one deck, on A deck, things get really interesting because this is where you start to see passenger cabins and staterooms and things like that. This is all very similar to Olympic. All the nice rooms are here, the first class lounge, the reading and writing room. These are all really well documented. They're beautifully represented in Titanic, Honor and Glory. I think my favorite staterooms on the ship have got to be these ones at the Grand Staircase, A36 and A37. They were inhabited by 2 of the more famous passengers on Titanic. One of those was Father Frank Brown. He was a priest who was traveling in the early part of Titanic's voyage, and he actually got off at Queenstown or Cove in Ireland, and he took a number of photographs of Titanic on board, including one actually taken in his stateroom, which is quite cool. The other stateroom was actually Thomas Andrews' stateroom, the designer of the ship, and I actually can't imagine a cooler cabin than to be right there, right at the Grand Staircase, where you could just walk out, walk into the smoking room, go down to the dining saloon, you're right there. It's very cool. You're right in the heart of it, you know? Here is the turbine casing. So this is the shaft that essentially sat over the second engine room that Titanic had. That was the central turbine engine room. And this also needed some fresh air. And the main engine room had its own shaft, but the turbine room had a very special apparatus as a way of getting fresh air down into the ship. And that was with the 4th funnel. Of course, the 4th funnel wasn't connected to any boilers that the Titanic used to burn coal, and so it didn't need to extract any smoke. And you can actually see here in this plan, this whole area is the casing. So this was kind of empty except for some baffles, some plating that separated it into different sections for different purposes. But here there is a staircase. And the reason there's a staircase is the crew could actually climb that staircase all the way up to the top of the 4th funnel. And have a smoke or have a breather. And there's a really very famous photograph of Titanic departing on her final voyage. You can actually see somebody's head just at the very top of the fourth funnel. Obviously someone who climbed this staircase. And if you follow this staircase in the plans, it goes all the way down, right down into the turbine room, which is hundreds of feet below. So if you're not like me and terribly afraid of heights, you should be fine climbing that staircase. We'll move down to B deck now, because this is where Titanic really distinguishes herself against Olympic. On the original 1911 plans that I was talking about from the shipbuilder, I gotta sneeze. I gotta do it. Nope. Maybe I'll just leave that in the video. I don't know. On the... it's too late. It's too late. On the original 1911 plans of the Olympic and Titanic, you can see that this whole area is a walking promenade. It is blank. There are some staterooms inboard of that, which would have had a nice little view, had some windows looking out on the promenade here. Most of it was for first class, but this little bit at the back was for second. On Titanic, they just deleted it. They realized there was too much walking space for passengers, and so this is where Titanic became larger than Olympic. The fact being that they took this section of open promenade that wasn't included in Olympic's gross registered tonnage, the way that they actually measured the size of the ship. Once they enclosed it and turned it into staterooms, it meant Titanic could count that space as gross registered tonnage, and therefore Titanic, even though it was the same size as Olympic, had a larger gross registered tonnage rating than her older sister ship, therefore being the biggest ship in the world, even though Olympic and Titanic were the same size. What's interesting about these spaces is these were where they installed the most unique, the most luxurious staterooms on the ship. And it all happened about here from the second to the third funnel. This is where you get, and it's marked out on the plans here, you can see all the different styles of cabin. You can see modern style, French style, the Louis XVI style, you can see modern Dutch, old Dutch, just a lot of different themes. And then on the port side, there's Queen Anne, which is another style. All different periods of interior design and architecture. Now here we can see the docking bridge at the very stern of the ship. They've actually separated this in the plan so you can get more of an idea of what's going on. You can actually see there's a telegraph to the bridge. So this is the way that, as I mentioned earlier, they would communicate, hey, cast off lines, make fast, slacken the lines, just to prepare the ship to get underway, basically. Just below this, down on C deck, you have one of my favorite spaces in the ship, and that is the steering engine room, or the steering gear room. And it's so underrepresented and kind of a bit of a mystery to a lot of people who are interested in Titanic. It's the room at the very back of the ship, essentially. And what's really interesting about it is it sits directly over the rudder, and it's got all the machinery that would have operated the ship's rudder. And that machinery comprises of a set of twin miniature reciprocating steam engines that you would have seen pretty much just like down in the engine room, the main engine room. And this is what would turn this in a really bizarre set of gears to essentially operate a quadrant to shift the rudder left or right. And then dotted around this space, you have a ton of other steam engines, so auxiliary steam engines operating the ship's capstans. So the capstans sit up, there are two of them, aft of the docking bridge, up on the poop deck, don't laugh, and then another set just forward of the docking bridge. And what capstans are essentially a drum that can pivot around a central point. So if you're trying to tighten the lines on the ship and bring it closer to the wharf, right, you take the lines, run it through a fair lead, so that was either a hole in the ship's hull if you wanted to do it below decks, or if you wanted to do it on deck, there were also a number of bits and bollards and things where you could secure the line, run it up on deck, and then slowly wrap it around the capstan, and then engage the steam engine of that capstan, and it would begin to turn. And as it turned, it would coil that rope around its drum. And of course, you're coiling that rope, it's attached to shore, it's going to slowly then bring the ship closer to the shore, and then you can stop the capstan. And the way that they operated it was there was a very simple set of pedestal controls up on deck that was essentially just a brake. That if you turned the wheel, it would essentially release a brake, allowing steam into the capstan steam engine down below in the steering engine room. And that would then begin to turn the capstan, and then you just wind it off, and that would cause it to stop. Probably the most interesting stuff is up here at the in the fireman's area. So this is where the guys who are down in the black gang who work down in the bunkers, you know, and the stoke hold, shoveling coal and keeping Titanic moving ahead and keeping those boilers fed. This is where they lived, and you can see that they had very, very basic digs. You don't need to be a architect to decipher this part of the plan. You can see that they had a galley that was very basic. Actually, there's an interesting story about the galley. Well, I think it's interesting, at the very least. Early on in Titanic's career, she had the same number of portholes on that side of the ship, on the port side, as Olympic. And they must have realized that it just wasn't enough. Because you imagine that that's where they're cooking food and trying to make enough meals to keep these guys, I think it was about 170, 180 men fed, working around the clock 24/7. They would need to make a lot of food. There's a lot of fumes, a lot of gases. They had a extractor and a skylight to try and get that stuff out, but it probably wasn't enough. So they, on Titanic, installed another porthole here to allow more fresh air in. You often see these portholes swung open as they desperately try to get as much fresh air in as they can. And then after Titanic sank, they did the same thing to Olympic. And for decades now, conspiracy theorists have been saying, there's more portholes on this side of the ship. And after Titanic sank, Olympic had them, so they clearly swapped the ships. And it's not true. It was very, very easy to cut a porthole in the side of a ship. It was a day job, literally a day. You had a machine, you just plonk it on the side of the ship, cut a hole in the steel that's perfectly circular, punch in some rivet holes, put a porthole in, smash the rivets home, and your porthole's ready. That's basically it. So you could just get it done in a day. So very interesting little detail that marked Titanic out from Olympic to begin with. Forward of this, you have a really interesting space, the windlass gear room. And this is a really good kind of twin space to the room at the very back of the ship that we were looking at, the steering gear room, because this is where they had all the machinery that would operate the insanely powerful windlasses that were designed to pull Titanic's anchors up. And these things weighed a lot. The central anchor weighed about 16 tons. The other anchors were a little less than that, but they were extremely heavy. So you needed some pretty heavy-duty gear to do this. So in this room, they had extremely powerful windlass steam engines that would essentially work in a very similar manner to the capstans, but they had to be much bigger, much meaner. And then also you have the same kind of capstan engines that you had at the stern of the ship, or essentially identical. There's something really interesting here. You can see a wire reel. And so this was a giant spool by which they could feed a steel rope or a wire out through the hawse hole, which is at the very bow of the ship. It kind of looks like an eye, and they could feed a cable through the wire, and from that reel, and then attach the central anchor of Titanic to that reel with the crane that was provided, the little triangular crane at the bow of the ship, and then lower the anchor away and provide a third anchor to secure Titanic in the event that she was moored and there was a storm coming in and she needed to be held fast. She would probably only ever have to do that in her service career, excluding wartime service, in probably Cove, Queenstown, maybe Cherbourg in France, because she was too big to enter the port there. She had to stand to and allow tenders to come out to her. So she'd be in the open water and she'd need to hold herself in place. But to the best of our knowledge, the third central anchor was never actually used. Down on D-Deck, we have forward the third class open space. So this was a kind of general room for the third class, which was probably the largest general room that they had on the ship, the largest space. And this is where they had the famous party on the final night before Titanic hit the berg. And they were celebrating, reaching a new world, starting a new life, getting to America. Unfortunately, as it would turn out, celebrated a little bit prematurely. And this is where that party happened. And in the film, they're dancing on top of these things here. This is the hatch cover, the number 2 and the number 3 hatches that you would essentially take all these boards off and be able to lower cargo down into the ship. Kind of unlikely that they would have been dancing on top of these because they were fenced off. They had like a little railing around them, and there was a small likelihood you would crash through all the way down into the bottom of the ship. So it was ill-advised. You can see they had a little bar, and it would have been a pretty cozy little space. I talk about this space a lot, but I had to do it again. We talked about it in the breakup video, but the pantry and the first and second class galleys here, can we just appreciate the size of this kitchen, like how insane this is? It runs from the number 3 funnel past the 4th funnel, and it's extremely impressive. What can I say? There's some really interesting little rooms in here, including the sculleries, the coal bunker. They needed coal to heat the ovens. A lot of these ovens were coal-fired, so they had to have their own little coal bunker here to be able to feed those. But in an interesting twist, just here on the starboard side of the ship, you can see the infectious hospital and the hospital wards. So, funny place to put it. Usually these were at the stern of the ship towards the back, but it could have been maybe so they could get fresh food to them quicker. I don't know. It's just in an interesting location. But here is one of the, well, probably 2 of the most interesting spots on the ship. One of these is, of course, the infectious hospital. So, disease at sea, bad news, not good. And in fact, Olympic had to be quarantined once, and she had to stand to in New York because there was an outbreak of an illness, which nobody likes. It meant nobody could get off the ship. Plague at sea could kill an entire ship's complement in the days of sail. Ships would be expected, if they landed and there was any sign of sickness or plague, that ship would be in quarantine until the illness had passed or everybody had died. It was pretty gnarly stuff. And so, by Titanic's day, they had a little bit of a better understanding of how this illness worked. So they had an infectious hospital. This could be actually sealed off, and if you were exhibiting signs of a contagious illness, you'd be put in this ward. But here is one of my favorite rooms on the ship, the padded room. It is exactly as it sounds like. It is a padded cell. In case anybody lost their mind, they would be put in that room. It was, if anyone were prone to hysterics or there are any kind of random outbursts or anybody criticized the chef's cooking, they'd be put in the padded room. That's true. Not many people know that. Titanic had a padded cell. So way back at the stern of the ship here, there are a couple of my favorite rooms on Titanic. And the reason for this being that this is the point where Titanic's stern began to curve, flare out really dramatically. Titanic had what is called a clipper stern. And this is a style of stern for a ship that had been popular from the mid 1800s all the way through to about the 1920s. Titanic was in the kind of last generation of ships that had this style of stern. And so it was like a knife towards the bottom of the ship. The profile was extremely lean and extremely sharp. And then as it got up, it suddenly flared out into this brilliant curve. And it meant that a lot of the cabins around here, like staterooms here, 136 and 137, had floors that were the flare of Titanic's stern as it came up, then would curve up to create the wall. So it wasn't like a 90-degree angled wall. It was just this consistent curve where like the floor just suddenly became the wall. And maximizing space, right? They put staterooms in there. They put cabins for third class. And they put bunks kind of like at that awkward bit where the wall becomes the floor. I think Chris Walker from Titanic, RMS Titanic Designs, has rendered a stateroom here. Really bizarre, kind of fun. If you had to stay in third class anywhere, that would be the one. It's also conveniently located down on E-Deck. Things become a little monotonous, except for one room. Possibly the most important room on Titanic. In fact, it's not even a room, it's a complex. Possibly more impressive than the galley and the kitchen. This is the potato complex. And I'm not making that up. You can see here that there are 2 spaces dedicated to potatoes. Now, this wasn't just to satisfy the Irish members of Titanic's passengers and crew. Potatoes were used in almost every meal. Potatoes are the best food. Everybody knows that. They are objectively the best food. I'm a Brady. My granddad was from Dublin. I know that potatoes are the best food. And Titanic was expected to carry a lot of them. So she needed to have a dedicated space. So here we have potato storage and a potato wash place with bins for the potatoes where they could be taken up, taken down to the galley, taken up to the galley, wherever they needed to go. A trough to wash them all, peel them, that kind of thing. how do you peel that many potatoes? You're not going to have people standing there all day doing this. Even as a punishment. Titanic had an electric potato peeler. It would be able to peel them en masse. It was probably going all day and all night. You can see it here marked out on the plans. You can see a little electric engine, which was like standard for the time, with a belt running to the machine, which would have had a big vat that you put all the potatoes in, and they get peeled. I can't believe we spent this much time talking about potatoes, but there you go. Okay, final sheet of the drawings. We are now down to F-Deck. And again, this is a space just jammed full of third-class staterooms, and it gets a little bit monotonous around here, but there is a really interesting thing about F-Deck, and this is where the big Scirocco fans were located that were designed to essentially pull fresh air in from all the way up at the top of the ship, deep down into the boiler rooms to keep it refreshed, to try and get some cool air down there, but it kind of didn't help because Titanic was, she had very hot boiler furnaces. I think it got up to as much as like 40 degrees Celsius or more. Down on G-Deck, and we are really getting down into the bottom of the ship here. You can still see that forward, there's still a lot of firemen, there's still a lot of engineers being kept here, but this is where we start to see some third class, and these were some of the third class who started to get their feet wet very early on in the night of the sinking. But here we have the engineer's store, the engineer's workshop, and the paint store. Again, some of these things that all ships need to carry, but things you might not immediately think of. You know, an engineer's workshop to do some really basic, simple repairs. You know, they've got a vise on the bench here, they've got a lathe, they can machine their own parts. If they break anything, they can actually take some bare steel and knock something out of it, turn it on the lathe. They can actually make some stuff, which is really cool. There's a paint store. Titanic would need to be constantly painted to keep that rust away, to keep her looking fresh. And this is where they'd keep all that paint. And then after this, after the turbine engine room, you have one of the really impressive spaces on the ship. And this is a large cold storage room, which has some probably surprising spaces you might not have thought of. You can see there's fruit, eggs, milk and butter, meat and poultry, all the stuff you'd expect. Vegetables, fish, whole rooms dedicated to this stuff, right? Mutton. Look how much space there is for mutton. That only shows how popular mutton was back in the day. But interestingly, there's an ice room. And to the right of that, you'll see there's an ice cream room. Ice cream was one of these things that was kind of new and exciting to be able to have at sea. I mean, this would have just been unthinkable very, very recently in the past by 1912 standards. So having an ice cream at sea was like the height of luxury, and it was all kept down here in the cold storage space. Down below on the all-up deck, we start to see some other really interesting little rooms. My third favorite room, behind the potato room and the padded cell, the champagne room. This is where they'd keep all the champagne. You can see the wine and spirits. We know that there was more kept up in the pantries because Titanic, when she sank and broke apart, a lot of this stuff was just spilled out. So there's tons of bottles of wine and champagne littering the seafloor. But there would have been a lot kept in this room. And what I would give just to have 10 minutes in that room. Really interestingly, on the starboard side though, you have two different rooms for beef. And if you thought mutton was important, you ain't got nothing on beef, because beef was so important that it would be split into two different sections for the voyage. Because of course, Titanic would be going out westbound to New York, coming back eastbound to the United Kingdom. She needs to carry enough beef for the entire voyage. So you have a dedicated westbound beef room for the voyage there. And you can see it's larger than the eastbound beef room because typically there'd be fewer passengers coming back to the United Kingdom. You'd have all the immigrants mostly sailing out to America and fewer coming back. Down here, we have the boiler rooms. And the boiler rooms we've covered in some pretty decent detail, as well as the engine rooms and the turbine engine room. So I'm not going to go into those, but I will talk briefly about these little things here. You can see there's a little marker here for ash ejectors. And typically, Titanic's boilers were, burning tons of coal. I think it was like 600 to 800 tons of coal per day. And that created a lot of ash. So what do you do with it all? You can't store it on board. You can't burn it. You can't really get rid of it any easy way or store it. So the best thing to do was to take it out and mix it with water and essentially get it over the side of the ship in a kind of sludge. And the way that they would do this is they would have these ash ejector units that would be operating on a constant loop, providing water at extremely high pressure that the ash could be shoveled into. And it would take the sludge that it created from down here in the bottom of the ship up 1 or 2 decks to above the waterline, and then spew it through scuppers, which are the little engineering holes all the way down the side of the ship, spew it out into the water directly. And it would do that constantly. So in old photographs of ships like this, you can constantly see water streaming out of the sides of these little scuppers. That could be engineering water. It could be toilet water. Yes, they didn't have sewage tanks. They literally just over the side of the ship. Makes the Titanic seem a little less romantic. And they would constantly be having this sludge, this slurry of water be being discharged over the side of the ship. Well, there you have it. We've looked at Titanic from the boat deck down to the tank top. We've picked out some interesting things. I'd really like to congratulate everyone who worked on this. It's pretty impressive. There's they say it takes a village to raise a baby, and there is a pretty impressive list of names here. There are some big Titanic heavy hitters in here, so I just wanted to say congratulations to everybody who contributed to this remarkable set of plans, and I could not recommend you getting your hands on them more. Go and visit the link that I left below. Well done to Matt DeWinkler, who worked extremely hard on these plans and getting them as accurately as possible. Of course, because Titanic's plans, the originals, have been, for the most part, long lost, aside from a few useful ones here and there, we'll never know for certain what the ship was like on the inside, but we can base a lot of assumptions off of her sister ship Olympic, that we have a really good idea of what her inside layout was like, as well as other ships from the era, because like I said, if you can understand Titanic, you can understand other ships just like her. You know that there was probably a potato room on other ships of Titanic's era, not just Titanic. I think every ship should have a potato room. Every house should have a potato room. Maybe this can be my potato room. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Never get sick of saying that. You know, in our series Grand Plans, we've looked at some of the finest ships ever designed. We are lucky enough to have access to a beautiful archive of really incredible ship blueprints and plans, but there is one towering name that we haven't yet looked at that I think is honestly almost criminal that we haven't looked at this ship yet, so today I'm here to rectify that mistake. It's hard to think of ships that are more revolutionary and boundary pushing than France's SS Normandie. The ship's come under some criticism of late, people saying it wasn't really that big of a deal, but the truth is it really was. It was a combination of a lot of different technologies from different ships that had been tested and proven over time. That is true. But you can't deny that looking at the thing and comparing it with the ships that had come just before it and some that were around at the same time, she was a huge step into the future. There are a lot of things about this ship's design that still kind of blow my mind, and I'm sure they will blow yours too if you're not already familiar with Normandie. So buckle up, because on today's episode of Grand Plans, we're diving in and taking a look at the spectacular, magnificent SS Normandie. So we have this really beautiful longitudinal plan. This is an elevation showing Normandie's starboard side. Now, the thing about Normandie is that a lot of the magic is happening on the inside of the ship. So in a future episode, we'll probably look at some deck plans and see exactly what's going on. But there's enough going on the outside of this ship to warrant talking about it. So let's have a quick fly around, as usual, from the front, work our way to the back, and learn just why Normandie was such a huge step in the right direction. So starting off here at the very bow of the ship, you can see that the prow, which is the very front, and the stem where it curves down there, has a pretty unique shape. So it's curved above the waterline, and then it essentially goes dead straight as it hits the waterline and then flares out in a bulbous bow. Now this hull shape was tested ad nauseam in the testing tanks at the French shipyard in Saint-Nazaire. And the truth is that the hull was a pretty revolutionary shape. She was extremely flared towards the bow section above the waterline, which would give her really good qualities and handling in rough weather. But the bulbous bow is something that had been tested and proven on later ships in the 1920s, like the Bremen, the Europa, but even before then on battleships. You know, some of those early 20th century US battleships like the Arizona and so on, they had a fairly similar bow shape. And what they realized was obviously that the bulbous bow was giving them some pretty substantial fuel economy savings. We've talked a little bit about how the bulbous bow works on the channel before, so I won't go too much into it, but I will say that the combination of a flared bow and a straight stem, for the French line at least, was a really good compromise in terms of the handling through rough weather, that she wasn't going to pitch too much. She wasn't going to, be blown out of the water or coming head onto huge waves too much. She'd ride fairly naturally. So every part of the ship's hull, every curve, had a really important role to play, and it was very deliberate. What's really interesting about this forward end of this ship, though, is how clean it is. You can see that there's really not a lot above the nameplate there. You see Normandie, and then above that there is the promenade deck. And the forecastle, the very bow deck of the ship, is plated over with what's called a whaleback deck. And this serves a couple of really important roles. Primarily, it's designed to ship big waves over the nose of the ship, and then you've got this monumental breakwater that essentially deflects the waves either side of the superstructure behind it. Now, other ships had breakwaters like this. This wasn't revolutionary, but having a whaleback deck on the bow that completely encases the forecastle means that water really can't accumulate on the bow of the ship. Now, we spoke to Stephen Payne, who's a proper naval architect and engineer, and he was explaining that the Queen Mary, which was in many ways the competitor to Normandie, didn't really have anything like this. And she had a well deck, which was the forecastle is there, then it steps down into another little deck, and then it comes up again at the superstructure. If she copped a big wave over the bow, the huge volume of water that was taken on, even just for a moment, as it drained away, we're talking, hundreds of tons. And so this would, for a moment, cause the ship to lose her stability, because there would be this added weight up top. So the ship could really roll because she was shipping huge waves over the bow, which is obviously extremely unpleasant for passengers. So Normandie's designers went out of their way to make sure that, Normandie wouldn't be a big roller, because they had experienced this with other French ships before that were notoriously bad. So the Normandie, they're obviously taking big steps to keep the ship stable. One of the other things that's interesting about this, though, is that, this is kind of what cruise ships look like now. All of the anchor handling equipment, you can actually just see it here, to the right of the nameplate. You can see marked in things like, capstans and, mooring bits and bollards and all these things that would otherwise be cluttering the upper deck. On the Normandie, they're covered. And that is really aesthetically quite pretty, because as much as nerds like me enjoy seeing big bits of ship machinery cluttering the decks, do Normandie's passengers really need to see that? Not necessarily. So ships of Normandie's vintage are really going above and beyond to begin to take considerations for the exterior of the vessel, what it looks like with all this clutter. They're modernizing, they're streamlining. This is right in the era of Art Deco and that real effort to streamline things. You think of Norman Bell Geddes' design for a future Oceanliner, and you think of some of those beautiful train designs that were coming out of that era. And it's all about getting rid of excess, getting rid of clunky things that sit out the front. One of the other interesting things that's kind of cool that you can see about Normandie is that there's a few different mooring positions. You've got one up here on deck A. We can see cutouts in the hull where the bits are, the fair leads, all the stuff that would secure Normandie to the dock. And then there's actually another position down here at deck B, or pont B, where you can see those capstans marked in and all these different bits and pieces for mooring the ship. It's all contained within the hull. So it's also protected from the elements. So for the crew actually having to moor the ship in winter in New York, I'm sure they would have really appreciated this. We've just moved along to Normandie's first funnel and the bridge and the forward superstructure. And so, this is, again, where Normandie is really beginning to differentiate herself from ships that had come before. Liners like Bremen and Europa had really set a new standard for the visual aesthetic of what an ocean liner should look like. They had these beautifully curved superstructures that were quite elegant, quite deco, but also extremely functional. They weren't blocky, they weren't, drag-inducing, they would deflect waves. And presumably even give a little boost to speed, because there would be less wind resistance. So Normandy took that to the nth degree and had all of her forward decks curving extremely dramatically, and so you can kind of see that here. But we're also starting to see some interesting bits of equipment installed on this ship. You know, in the past, all they had to rely on were, for navigation and communication and things like that, were the Marconi wireless. Systems that had been in practice, you know, and in use by this point for like, you know, 20, 30 years. And so by the time Normandy comes along, there were new systems of navigating, like, you know, direction finding, triangulation, and things like that. So she's installed with these big direction finding loops. You can see one right here on the forward end of the bridge to help with her navigation, to pinpoint her location, and make it a lot easier on the approach into New York to figure out exactly where she is by triangulating her position, you know, comparing signal frequencies from stations ashore with Normandy's own position to, you know, essentially navigate and guide themselves in as accurately as possible. Because before then, you know, it was a dicey proposition, you know, like even into the early 20s, it was, you know, fairly difficult to navigate these things, especially in fog. And so many of them ran aground over, you know, on the east coast of the US. So this is a huge step forward. If we just come down a little bit, you can actually see there's a series of big double doors that line the hull. They're all for different things. You know, there's like a first class entranceway here, but the really interesting one is down here. It says embarquement aux autos, basically embarkation for cars. So Normandy had a garage, and you could drive your car on board. I mean, how cool is that? They don't do that anymore. You know, this is kind of this, again, big step into the future. You can just take your car across the Atlantic, no worries. It's really cool. It's a shame they don't do that on ships anymore. But yeah, there was a gangway that could be led from the pier, put your car on, take your car off, and you would go through these doors. There was one on the port side, there was one on the other side as well. You know, just another thing here, you can see the cargo handling equipment is really heavily reduced to just a pair of cranes, you know, on ships from even not that long before, like Ile-de-France and other ships like that. From ships not that long before Normandy's construction, you know, there were winches and derricks and all these booms, all this stuff, tackle and everything, just like absolutely cluttering the forward end of the ship. Big masts, all this stuff was needed, and it's just the way they had built ships forever, basically. But by the time Normandy comes along, you know, they have the brilliant idea of just fitting electric cranes, just a pair of them. They're big enough that they can swing over and, you know, pick bits of cargo up and load them in through the hatch here. Normandy isn't, you know, leaning into the cargo handling that ships, you know, 20 years or even 10 years might have done. She's, you know, it's almost really an afterthought, and it's evident because, yeah, she's just got a pair of cranes here, and that's kind of it, you know. Normandy is doing the job of what 2 or 3 smaller, lesser ships would have done. You know, this is the mentality. You build a big enough ship that has enough space for enough people that can go quickly enough and efficiently enough to make up for, you know, the cost and maintenance of having to run 3 smaller ships. So it's an equation, and so everything goes into it. Normandie is a big, big, big ship. You know, she's over 1,000 feet long. She's up in the region of like 80,000 tons. So she's a really decently sized liner for this age. And so, you know, she's making most of her money, all of her money almost really, from passenger berthing, from first, second, and third class. But there was a huge focus on the amenities for first class. And rather famously, the other classes were kind of not as, shall we say, well considered in many ways. But we'll come to that later on. So we've just moved back to between the first and the second funnel. And again, you know, one of the things that's really obvious here is just how much deck space there is. I mean, a lot of the stuff that would otherwise be cluttering the upper decks has been encased in deck houses, you know, and this is how they build ships today. You know, there are all these fans and ventilation equipment and air conditioning and everything. That on other ships that were older had cluttered the decks. And in Normandie's case, they've put them in these really rather impressive deck house bases for the funnels. You can tell that there are fans and vents and things in there because there are these huge grill covers that wrap around the front. That's really like the only clue that there's all this stuff in there. The funnels are enormous, as you can tell. But what's really cool is that they're illuminated by these lights. They had spotlights shining up at the funnels, which was a thing that became more popular to do through the 40s and the 50s and into the 60s. Not so much the 40s, because, you know, wartime, ships were trying to darken themselves out so as not to be destroyed. But, you know, in peacetime, shining lights on funnels made the ships look very, very impressive at nighttime. And it's kind of a little counterintuitive to think that before then, I guess no one had really thought to do it. And so ships like, you know, Lusitania and Mauretania and Titanic, which had these spectacular towering funnels at nighttime, they weren't illuminated, unlike what you might think from watching films. So, you know, this is all about, you know, showing off your ship. It's all now marketing. It's all really leaning into, look how big and beautiful this ship looks in all conditions. Why don't you buy a ticket? And it's, you know, a great bit of PR. But also it's the age, right? It's the late 20s, the early 30s. It's glitz, it's glamour, it's lights, it's showtime. And Normandie is all about glitz and glamour. You know, she's got all these big nestled lifeboats which have propellers. They're probably not motorized. They're probably using Fleming gear or something like that, which is essentially, instead of rowing, passengers would, you know, turn a crank or something like that, which would provide inertia and, you know, power for a propeller or a pair of propellers. But she does have a pair of these powered motorboats. You can just see one right here. These are big boats. I mean, this is, you know, the size of a private yacht, right? So, you know, it really shows the scale, I guess, of ships the size of Normandy when their boats and their lifeboats and things are like the size of, you know, your modern day standard sailing boat, sailing yacht. It's pretty impressive. Aquitania back in 1914 had powered boats, so this wasn't necessarily a revolutionary thing, but it's still really cool seeing them. I don't know how confident I would be standing underneath those things swung overhead when you know they weigh a couple of tons. Normandy also used gravity davits, so this is the age of the gravity davit becoming the thing for maritime safety. Huge improvement over what had come before. The davit essentially is just dropped with gravity, goes over the side, lowers the boat. It's a big step forward. Of course, all the, you know, the lowering equipment by this point is motorized, so, you know, it's not people heaving on lines or anything like that. So, you know, big step forward in terms of safety as well, just for getting boats away. Of course, one of the things that you can see wrapping around the superstructure is the beautiful enclosed promenade deck. You can see all these big windows up here on the upper promenade. So we've talked about promenades before, but it still, you know, makes me sad that the enclosed promenade has disappeared from ships. But back in the day, you know, Normandie's enclosed promenade was a beautiful big space where you could basically do a full wrap-around walk around the ship in first class. And there are all the main public spaces leading off it. This would have been a, you know, a real selling point, because it means in, you know, really tough Atlantic weather, in the, you know, storms, in the rain, in the wind, there's always a place to lie down and read a book, which is really quite cool. You can also see here that there is a absolute battery of boarding doors for first class. So there's the set here, I think this is B deck off the top of my head, and then down here you can see more. Now this is just all for first class. So this is the main boarding entrance. And so it's right in the heart of the ship, and you can really tell that this is the you know, the amount of importance put onto first class is beginning to show, because they've got 4 big doors and they're all right in the middle of the ship. In second and third class, there's a couple of doors and they're all the way back there. So now back here at the base of the third funnel, and you can see some of those big, you know, ventilator grills that we were talking about earlier. So there's a lot of plant and equipment and things hidden behind here. What's really interesting about the third funnel is that it has an old style tri-bell whistle. These are really similar to the ones that were mounted on ships like, I hate to say it, but Olympic and Titanic and Lusitania. Very old fashioned. These have actually been preserved, I think, and they still blow steam through them. They still work just fine, which is really cool. Presumably, this was a backup to what Normandie mounted on her first funnel, which was one of the, or I think a set of Typhon horns. Now, Typhon horns, they're called whistles, but they probably have more in common with a horn, were, you know, big units that could be heard out to, I think, something like 9 or 10 miles. And Queen Mary actually mounted a very similar pair. So they're a pretty impressive piece of kit, but that would be the main voice of the Normandie, I'd imagine. And I don't know if these steam whistles served as like a auxiliary, you know, like a foghorn or maybe something like that, but it's really funny as well to have them mounted on the reverse side of the third funnel. It's kind of like a weird place to put them. Normandie was known as the Ship of Light, and mainly it's because her first class interiors were absolutely covered in light fittings of all different sorts. You know, all the cut crystal chandeliers and towering columns of light were basically everywhere. But she also employed some pretty impressive tall windows. So you can see these lining the boat deck here. There's a whole battery of these things that allow tons of natural light into, you know, all these beautiful first class rooms that were back here. And so, again, this is very much of the age, but it's all about light. It's all about lightness. And, you know, Normandie's first class rooms, when you look at pictures of them from the inside, you really get a sense of, you know, a real sense of lightness, of airiness. And it's all because of this, you know, clever playing with space. Normandie used a lot of raised ceilings, a lot of lowered decks, a lot of raised decks to create, you know, artificial gaps and spaces where they would be able to place these big rooms with huge ceiling heights. So her first class spaces deep in the, you know, in the center line of the ship, like the first class smoking room, like the first class dining saloon, were unbelievably tall, you know, 3 stories tall, at least 4 stories. Some of the other rooms, like towards the after end of the ship here, some of the bars and things like that still had extremely impressive ceilings, and so they've made absolutely the most of it by providing them with these floor-to-ceiling windows, which is really, really spectacular, and the effect is beautiful. You know, we were talking about the doors and boarding points and things like that, so this is where we start to see some of the boarding points for the other classes. So second class, very cleverly, French line was calling tourist class. You can see here that there's a boarding point for tourists. There's another one here. There's 2 of them. So, you know, this is where your second class would be coming in. And then way down the bottom, right down here, below the tourist class, you have third class boarding point at D-Deck. So, yeah, way down the back of the ship, way down at the bottom. And then just forward of it, you have crew boarding. So this is for personnel. Not exactly a glamorous boarding point, but, you know, at least you're on one of the finest ships afloat, I guess, so you can't complain too much. You know, it's really great looking at the stern like this because you get this sensation of, you know, again, openness. There's so much open deck space, and again, the stern has got a, you know, an enclosed mooring deck where all that equipment, all that heavy stuff is housed. There's even an extra anchor back here. You can actually just see it here with the pipe that would have led up into the mooring deck, and that's because, you know, where Normandie was expected to operate shallow anchorages and things like that off France, it might be that she, you know, could need to stand to and wait her turn to berth, or might need to, you know, wait up a while. So being able to secure the ship forward and aft, having anchors that can actually hold her in place, is very important, because you absolutely do not want 1,000+ foot long ocean liner breaking loose or swinging wildly out of control or anything like that. But I think what's really cool here is that there's actually a folding platform you can see just here marked out, that presumably would have been used during the mooring process, or maybe even for depth sounding or something like that. And they still have those on cruise ships today, where you will see somebody with a walkie-talkie on one of these folded out platforms, basically supervising the mooring process. You could have a, you know, an officer or, you know, a senior sailor or somebody like that on the platform, you know, communicating with the people who are running the, you know, operating the heavy steam equipment that is warping Normandie, bringing her closer or further away from the dock. It's a very important job, and so it relies on somebody actually being able to see what's going on. So having a platform that can come out is extremely useful. So there was one there. There was actually also secretly one forward at the bow. You can see it right here. So again, like really, really clever stuff, and it's what is the norm today on cruise ships. So, you know, again, this ship is really, really forward thinking. She was designed largely by a Russian emigre to France named Vladimir Yorkovich, and he was a really forward thinking guy. It's just fascinating seeing the shape, the form of Normandy, because no other ship had been built prior to this point that looked anything like this. You know, it's easy to take for granted now. And, you know, the fact that Normandy was such a revolution is reflected in the fact that Cunard Line, who were a big competitor to French Line or CGT, who operated and built Normandy, Cunard Line were a little bit more reserved in the way that they built ships. And Queen Mary, which was built around the same time as Normandy, was a lot more old-fashioned from the outside. It was just more in the tradition of how ships had always been built. And by the time they built her running mate, Queen Elizabeth, not too long after, you know, the game had changed thanks to ships like Normandy. And so you see on Queen Elizabeth a lot of design cues from Normandy, you know, the rounded superstructure. You see the, you know, the raked bow. You see the, you know, the deck houses with the big vents. Queen Elizabeth, in many ways, from the outside, has more in common with Normandy than Queen Mary. And, you know, it sets the trend. And this is just how ships are built from then on. And so it's really cool getting to see it from the outside here. You know, again, most of the really interesting, groundbreaking stuff is more so happening on the inside of the ship, you know, where we're talking about decks being raised, you know, these huge roofs being put into place. It's pretty interesting stuff. So we'll probably do that in part 2. Not too long after they built Normandy, they would be welding ships instead of riveting them. So, you know, this is like about as big as you can make riveted ships. This is the very pinnacle of, you know, building ships in a tradition that had started back in the 1800s, because then things would change with the introduction of, you know, welding and things like that in the 40s and 50s. So, you know, well done, French Line. Really, really spectacular ship. She was obviously a big step forward. You can tell just from looking at it that there is a lot here that was unique, that was, you know, a step in the right direction. And, you know, I don't understand why people criticize Normandy so much in the Oceanliner community. There are a lot of people who say that the, you know, revolutionary nature of her design is kind of overblown, which I understand. You know, there is a lot of hyperbole written around ships like Normandy, but, you know, it's kind of hard to dismiss the fact that other shipping lines did end up, you know, taking some design cues, at least from at least the exterior of the ship. The interior is a whole other story that we'll probably talk about next time. But yeah, it was pretty spectacular, but a little bit too much maybe like a gallery, which I think made some people feel uncomfortable. But anyway, that is a bit of a primer on the design of Normandy. We're going to be going into the real details of this ship in a, you know, near future video. We're going to be telling the story of her design, her construction, and her career. She's an absolute favorite. You know, I'd like to say they don't build ships like this anymore, and in many ways they don't, but there are a lot of, you know, things taken from ships like Normandy that are still present on ship designs today, and it's thanks to pioneering efforts like Normandy that mean that we, you know, get to enjoy, you know, the ships that we do now. So what do you think about the Normandy? Was there a detail that you would have liked me to cover that I might have missed? Do you think the ship is overblown and wasn't really that revolutionary? Let me know in the comments. If there's another ship you'd like me to look at, let me know in the comments below and I'll check the archive and see if we've got plans of it. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again.